The first scream of the wind came before dawn, low and hollow, like something moving through a throat too narrow for it. It slid across the plains and struck the grain silo with a dull metallic groan, a sound that made the iron ribs shudder and carry the noise inward, wrapping it around the woman crouched inside. She paused with her hands on the lantern, breath caught, listening. The sound wasn't new. The silo always complained when the weather shifted, but this time there was weight behind it, pressure, a promise that whatever was coming was not passing through. Martha Klein did not climb out to look. She had learned better than that. She stayed where she was, inside the curved belly of rusted steel that the rest of the settlement had laughed at her for choosing. The lantern light flickered across the interior walls, catching the old scrape marks left by grain augers, the patched seams where she had sealed gaps with pitch and cloth, the narrow wooden platform she had built above the dirt floor so water wouldn't pool around her feet. Everything in the space was deliberate. Nothing here was accidental. That was the part no one had ever understood. Outside, the sky was already the wrong color. Not dark, not light, but a flat, bruised gray that swallowed distance. The horizon had vanished sometime in the night. When Martha finally pushed open the narrow hatch she'd cut into the silo's side and stepped out, the air slapped her hard enough to steal her breath. The wind came sideways, carrying grit and old snow and the sharp smell of ice. It cut through her coat and found her skin like it had been waiting. Across the field, the settlement still stood. Cabins crouched low against the ground, smoke lifting lazily from a few chimneys. From here, it looked almost peaceful. That was how storms fooled people on the plains. They gave you a moment to believe you had time. Martha pulled the hatch shut behind her and latched it tight. She checked the seals by touch, pressing her palm along the metal edge, feeling for drafts. Satisfied, she turned toward the well bucket hanging from a post beside the silo and hauled it up, muscles burning as the rope rasped. The water came up clear and cold. She filled 2 jugs and carried them back inside without looking toward the cabins again. By the time the first door banged open in the settlement, Martha was already back in the dark, her back against the silo wall, counting seconds between gusts. She had learned the rhythm of storms the way other people learned scripture, the long breaths, the sudden strikes, the way the sound changed when snow started riding the wind instead of just air. The mocking had started the day she moved in. It had been early autumn then, the kind of season that made men careless. The silo had stood abandoned at the edge of the fields, its boards warped at the base, its metal skin scarred with rust and old dents. The previous owner had died 2 winters back, and no one wanted the structure. Grain silos were for harvest, not living. Everyone knew that. Martha had been newly widowed, though she didn't use the word yet. It felt too large, too final. Her husband had been buried with the summer still clinging to the ground, the dirt refusing to harden properly over his coffin. She'd sold the cabin they'd shared faster than anyone thought wise, taken the small amount of cash, and walked away before grief could rot into something heavier. When she'd told the settlement she was moving into the silo, laughter had rippled through the men like a shared joke. "You planning to store yourself for winter?" one of them had called. Another had shaken his head, smiling like he was indulging a child. "That thing'll turn into an ice drum come first frost." Martha hadn't argued. She never did. She had only nodded, thanked them for their concern, and kept hauling boards and tools out to the field alone. What they hadn't seen, or hadn't bothered to understand, was how she worked, how she studied the structure before touching it, how she measured the way sound moved inside the curved walls, how the wind slid around it instead of catching corners, how the snow piled evenly instead of drifting into choking banks. She had grown up farther north than any of them, in a place where survival was less about strength and more about listening. Inside the silo she had built slowly, an inner wall first, made of salvage planks set a few inches off the metal skin, leaving a dead air space that trapped warmth. She lined the gaps with straw packed tight, sealed with clay she mixed herself. The floor came next, raised and insulated, with a shallow pit beneath for storing root vegetables and keeping water from freezing. She cut the hatch low so heat wouldn't bleed out every time it opened, and reinforced it with iron straps scavenged from a broken wagon. When winter came early that year, the men stopped laughing quite as loudly. Her lantern still burned at night when theirs sputtered. Smoke didn't pour uselessly from her roof because she didn't have one. The silo breathed differently. It held heat the way the earth did. But pride dies hard, and people don't like being proven wrong quietly. The storm that came now was not like those early snows. It did not announce itself with flakes drifting down. It came with violence. By mid-morning, the wind was screaming, no longer moving around the silo, but hammering it from all sides. The metal skins sang under the pressure, a deep, vibrating hum that rattled the shelves and made the lantern sway. Martha sat on the low stool she'd bolted to the floor, her back braced, eyes closed. She kept her breathing slow. Panic wasted heat. She had sealed herself in for storms before, sometimes for days, emerging to a world rearranged. She trusted the work of her hands more than the promises of weather. The first cabin roof went sometime after noon. She didn't see it happen, but she heard it. A crack like a gunshot, followed by the wet, tearing sound of wood failing. The noise carried through the wind and struck the silo in a way that made her flinch despite herself. Somewhere out there, someone was running. By late afternoon, the storm had erased the settlement. Snow drove sideways so thickly that even the nearest shapes vanished. The wind found every seam, every weak joint, every lie people had told themselves about how solid their homes were. Chimneys toppled, walls bowed, the cabins, built square and light to save time and labor, took the full force of the storm head-on. Inside the silo, the sound changed again. It grew steadier, less shrill. Snow began to pack against the curved walls, layering on itself, adding insulation instead of pressure. The temperature inside dropped, then stabilized. Martha checked the thermometer she'd hung near the shelf. It was cold, but survivable. She fed the small stove she'd set in the center, its exhaust pipe running up through the inner wall and venting through a carefully sealed opening near the top. The metal around it grew warm to the touch. As darkness fell, she heard shouting. At first it was distant, torn apart by the wind. Then it came closer, voices breaking, calling names. A fist hammered against the silo wall, the impact dull and desperate. "Martha!" someone screamed. "Open up!" She stood slowly. Her legs were stiff, her joints aching from the cold. She did not rush. She had learned long ago that fear made people reckless. The knocking came again, harder this time. Someone was crying. Someone else was coughing, deep and wet. Martha moved to the hatch and rested her hand against it, feeling the vibration from the wind and the bodies pressed close outside. For a moment she saw the faces of the men who had laughed, heard their voices, felt the old sharp ache of being dismissed. Then she unlatched the door. The wind tried to tear it from her hands as she cracked it open, snow blasting inside. She braced herself and pulled harder. A man fell forward, half collapsing at her feet, his beard caked with ice, eyes wide with something like disbelief. "Get inside!" she shouted, grabbing his collar and dragging him in. "One at a time! Don't crowd the door!" They came in twos and threes, shaking, bleeding, carrying children wrapped in whatever scraps they'd been able to grab. The silo filled with steam and the sharp smell of fear. Martha slammed the hatch shut behind the last of them and threw the bar across it, sealing the storm out again. The mocking had stopped, not because anyone had apologized, but because there was no room left for it. As the wind howled outside and the silo held, Martha moved through the cramped space, handing out blankets, positioning people where the heat would be strongest, her voice calm and steady. This was not triumph. This was survival, and the night was far from over. By the time the hatch was barred and the last of the wind-muted cries faded outside, the silo no longer felt like a structure meant for grain. It felt like a body holding too many hearts inside it, each one beating hard and fast, throwing heat and fear into the narrow space. Breath clouded the air, snow melted from coats and boots, and ran in thin lines toward the edges of the raised floor, where Martha had carved shallow channels to guide water away. She watched those channels now, relieved to see them doing exactly what she had designed them to do. "Sit," she said, not loudly, but with a firmness that cut through the noise. "If you stand, you'll fall. If you fall, you'll take someone with you." They listened. That surprised some of them. A few hours earlier, they would not have. A few months earlier, they would have smiled and ignored her. Now they lowered themselves where she pointed, backs against the inner wall, knees drawn up, children tucked close. The curved space forced them inward, made them face each other whether they wanted to or not. The man she had dragged in first was still on the floor, chest heaving. His name came to her slowly, Elias Porter. He had been one of the loudest voices that autumn day, the one who'd joked about storing herself for winter. His lips were blue now, his hands shaking so hard his teeth clicked when he tried to speak. Martha knelt beside him without comment and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, pulling it tight. She pressed a tin cup into his hands and tipped it until he drank. The broth was thin but hot. Heat mattered more than fullness right now. "Slow," she told him when he choked. "You've got time. The storm isn't going anywhere." That was not entirely true, and they both knew it. But people needed something steady to hold on to, even if it was a lie trimmed to fit the moment. Someone near the wall began to sob, a child, no older than 7, her face red and raw from cold and crying. Her mother clutched her too tightly, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers that tangled together and lost their shape. Martha stood and crossed the short distance between them, crouching down so her face was level with the child's. "What's your name?" she asked. The girl hiccuped. "Anna, Anna," Martha repeated. "I'm Martha. Can you do something for me? The girl nodded automatically, eyes wide. I need you to count the lantern breaths, Martha said, tapping the metal casing gently. Every time it flickers, that's one. Count to 10, then start again. Can you do that? Anna swallowed and nodded again, her attention shifting, fear loosening its grip just enough. Martha gave her a small smile and stood, moving on before gratitude or questions could slow her down. She checked the stove next, adjusting the damper, careful not to overfeed it. Too much heat too fast would crack metal, warp seals. Everything in this space worked because it was balanced. She had built it that way on purpose. Outside, something slammed hard against the silo's wall. The sound reverberated through the metal, a deep, hollow boom that made several people cry out. Someone shouted that it was the wind tearing cabins apart, that the whole settlement was coming loose. Martha listened closely, head tilted. The sound had been solid, heavy, not boards or roofing, something larger. A wagon, she said after a moment. Or what's left of one. It'll settle once the snow packs around it. Her calm did not erase the fear, but it gave it edges. It made the chaos feel contained. Something that could be endured instead of something that would swallow them whole. Hours dragged on. The storm did not weaken. If anything, it grew meaner, the wind shifting directions, testing the silo from every angle. Snow pressed higher against the walls, and the metal skin sang constantly now, a low, unbroken note that vibrated through bones and teeth. People slept in fits and starts, heads dropping, bodies jerking awake at every new sound. Martha did not sleep. She moved among them, adjusting blankets, checking hands and feet for signs of frostbite, waking people gently to make them drink. She kept track of the children first, then the elderly, then everyone else. It was not kindness so much as triage. She had learned that word years ago from a doctor passing through her childhood town, and it had never left her. Sometime deep in the night, the storm shifted again. The pitch of the wind dropped, not fading, but changing. The pressure on the walls became more even, less violent. Martha felt it through her back where she leaned against the silo, eyes closed, counting heartbeats. Snow was no longer scouring the metal. It was settling. That was when the screaming started again. It came from farther away this time, muffled but unmistakable. A man's voice, hoarse and panicked, calling for help. Another voice joined it, then another. They were not at the door yet. They were lost in the storm, somewhere beyond the reach of sight. Several people inside the silo surged to their feet instinctively, moving toward the hatch. "No," Martha said sharply. "Sit down. They'll freeze," someone yelled back. "We have to open it, and if you open it wrong, you'll freeze everyone in here," she snapped, louder now. "Sit down." Her voice cut through them like a blade. They hesitated, torn between fear for those outside and the immediate physical reality of the space they were in. Martha moved to the hatch and braced her shoulder against it, not opening it, but listening. She waited for the screams to come closer. They did, inch by inch, the sound changing as the wind carried it differently, as bodies struggled through drifts that reached chest height. When the knocking finally came, it was weaker than before, desperate but fading. Martha unbarred the hatch again. The blast of cold was brutal, stealing breath, stinging skin. She leaned into it, muscles screaming as she pulled the door wide enough for a body to fall through. A man collapsed inside, followed by another. They were rimed with ice, coats stiff, movements slow and clumsy. "Close it," Martha barked once they were in. Hands scrambled to obey, the hatch slamming shut, the bar dropping back into place. The newcomers lay gasping on the floor, eyes glassy. One of them laughed weakly, a broken sound. Thought you were dead," he rasped, looking at Martha. "Thought that silly tin thing would have crushed you." Martha did not answer. She was already kneeling, checking pulses, rubbing circulation back into numb limbs, her focus absolute. The words slid off her like snow off the silo's walls. Dawn came without light. The storm had blotted out the sun so completely that morning was only a concept, marked by exhaustion more than by brightness. People stirred, groaning, stiff, blinking in the lantern glow like creatures dragged up from underground. The air inside the silo smelled of smoke, damp wool, and human closeness. It was not pleasant, but it was alive. Martha checked the thermometer again, still holding. She allowed herself a single, careful exhale. Someone near the back began to speak, voice rough with sleep and cold. "My house. It was solid. I built it myself." No one answered him. Another voice followed, quieter. "Mine too." Silence settled, heavy and uncomfortable. Outside, the wind still roared, but it had lost its edge. The storm was no longer attacking, it was burying. Martha leaned back against the wall, finally letting her eyes close for more than a moment. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired, bone deep, marrow heavy, tired. But she also felt something else, something steadier beneath it. They had made it through the worst of the night. That did not mean they were safe. The storm still had a long way to go, And when it ended, what waited outside would change everything they thought they knew about home, about shelter, about the woman they had laughed at for choosing a grain silo over 4 straight walls. The storm did not end with drama. It did not break suddenly or lift like a curtain. It simply kept going, hour after hour, grinding the world down into something flatter and quieter than before. By the time the wind finally eased enough to be called a lull, no one inside the silo trusted it. They had learned better in the night. Martha was the first to notice the change, not because she was watching the hatch, but because the metal beneath her palm had stopped trembling. So the constant vibration she had leaned against for hours, felt through bone and teeth and breath, was gone. In its place was a heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional scrape of snow sliding down the curved walls outside. She opened her eyes slowly. "Don't move yet," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Several people had already begun to stir, muscles stiff, joints aching. A man near the stove tried to stand, and nearly collapsed when his leg failed him. Someone else laughed weakly at that, then clamped a hand over their mouth as if afraid the sound might summon the storm back. Martha crossed the space and pressed a hand to the man's shoulder, guiding him back down. "You've been sitting too long. Blood's not where it should be. Give it a minute." "How long?" someone asked from the wall. She did not answer right away. She tilted her head, listening not to the absence of wind, but to what filled that absence instead. Snow settling, ice shifting, the faint, distant groan of wood somewhere far out on the plains. Giving up under weight it was never meant to hold. "Long enough," she said finally. They waited. The children slept hardest, curled against parents or strangers alike, small bodies rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Martha moved among them again, careful and quiet, adjusting blankets, checking faces. Frostbite had been kept at bay so far, but the cold left marks even when it didn't kill. She rubbed color back into cheeks and fingers, murmuring soft instructions that sounded almost like lullabies. Elias Porter watched her from where he sat, his back against the wall, eyes tracking her movements. He looked smaller than he had before. His shoulders hunched, his confidence folded inward. When she finally passed close enough, he cleared his throat. "You planned this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't praise. It was something closer to awe, edged with shame. Martha paused, meeting his gaze. "I prepared," she corrected. "There's a difference," he nodded slowly. "None of us did." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The words hung between them, not sharp, but heavy. Elias looked away first. When the time came, Martha chose it carefully. She gathered everyone's attention with a raised hand rather than a shout. "I'm opening the hatch," she said, "just enough to look. No one rushes. No one speaks unless I ask. If the wind comes back hard, I close it again. Understood?" A murmur of assent moved through the group, nervous but controlled. She unbarred the door slowly. The metal scraped, loud in the sudden quiet. When she cracked it open, cold air spilled inside, but it lacked the violence of before. It slid in low and heavy, carrying the smell of snow and broken wood. Martha leaned forward, peering out. The world had disappeared. Where the settlement had stood was now a field of white, uneven and distorted, like something half buried and forgotten. Snowdrifts rose where cabins had been, smooth and rounded, betraying the shapes beneath only by the faintest ridges. A chimney jutted up at an angle not far from the silo, snapped clean in two. Beyond that, nothing broke the horizon. She opened the hatch wider. Gasps rippled through the silo behind her. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else swore under their breath. Martha stepped out onto the packed snow. Saw to boots sinking only slightly thanks to the wind-scoured ground around the silo's base. The storm had done what she'd expected. It had filled every corner, every straight edge, every weakness. The square cabins had trapped snow against themselves until the weight became too much. Roofs had bowed, then given way. Walls had collapsed inward, leaving no space, no air pockets, no shelter. The silo stood alone, its curved sides shedding snow naturally, the drifts forming evenly around it like a protective mound. One by one, she let the others come out, cautioning them to stay close. They stood in stunned silence, staring at what remained of their homes. Some dropped to their knees without realizing it, hands buried in snow, as if they could dig their lives back out by force alone. "My house was right there," a woman said, pointing at a smooth rise no different from any other. Her voice broke on the last word. Martha said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. They searched where they could, marking spots, digging carefully, but it was quickly clear that nothing could be recovered yet. The storm had not finished its work. The snow was dense, heavy, packed tight by wind and ice. Digging blindly was dangerous. Collapse could still come. They retreated back into the silo before the cold could reclaim them. Inside, the reality of what waited beyond the hatch settled in fully. The silo was no longer an emergency refuge. It was the only standing structure for miles. "We can't stay like this," someone said. "There's not enough space." "There's enough for now," Martha replied. And there's more than you'll find anywhere else. For how long? She met their eyes one by one. Long enough to make a plan. That word, plan, shifted something. It gave shape to fear, turned it into something that could be worked with instead of endured. They rationed food carefully. Martha inventoried what she had stored and what the others had carried in. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. She assigned tasks. Not because she wanted control, but because people needed purpose. Some cleared meltwater channels, some tended the stove, others watched the children so parents could rest. Days blurred together, the storm lingered, its tail dragging on, snow falling lightly but relentlessly. The silo grew cramped, tempers flaring, then cooling again under Martha's quiet authority. Disputes were settled quickly, firmly. Without spectacle, she did not raise her voice, she did not plead, she simply acted as if survival was expected, not optional. At night, when the lanterns were low and sleep came in shallow waves, people talked in whispers, about mistakes, about warnings ignored, about how they had laughed. Martha heard them. She did not join in. On the fourth day, the sky finally cleared. Sunlight spilled through the open hatch in a way that made people shield their eyes, blinking, stunned by the return of color. The world outside was blindingly white, the snow reflecting light so fiercely it hurt to look at directly. But the wind was gone. The air was still. They emerged again, squinting, breath steaming. With daylight came understanding. The settlement was gone, not damaged, not wounded, erased. The cabins were crushed flat beneath the snow, their outlines barely discernible. The roads had vanished. The landmarks people had used to navigate were swallowed whole. Only the silo remained fully visible, its upper half rising cleanly from the drifts like a marker placed deliberately by the land itself. Someone laughed then, a short, incredulous sound. Of all the damn things, no one argued. They gathered near the silo's base, huddled against its shadow. The question none of them wanted to ask finally surfaced, spoken by a man whose hands shook even now. What do we do now? Martha looked out across the plains, then back at the people who had once doubted her. She felt the weight of their eyes, not mocking now, but searching, expectant. We rebuild, she said, but not the way you did before. Silence followed. Then Elias spoke, voice rough. Ma, using this? He gestured toward the silo. Martha nodded once. Using what works. Some bristled. Pride did not die easily, but the land around them offered no alternative, only proof. That night, as the temperature dropped again, and the stars burned sharp and cold above the plains, they slept inside the silo once more. But the feeling was different now, less like hiding, more like gathering. The storm had taken their houses. It had not taken their chance to learn. Rebuilding did not begin with hammers. That surprised many of them. On the first clear morning after the storm finally loosened its grip, several men stood near the silo with salvaged tools in their hands, stamping their feet against the cold, waiting for Martha to tell them where to start tearing into the snow. Old habits clung stubbornly. Work, to them, had always meant force first and thought second. Martha made them wait. She climbed the ladder, bolted along the inside wall of the silo, and emerged onto the narrow platform she had built months ago, just below the rim. From there, she could see farther than anyone else. The plains stretched out white and unbroken, the land reshaped into something smoother, harsher, and more honest than before. The wind had carved subtle lines into the snow, showing where it flowed and where it pooled. Those lines mattered. She studied them for a long time. When she finally came down, she did not give speeches. She pointed. Dig there, she said, indicating a shallow trough where the snow lay thinner. And there, not straight down, sideways. Let the snow hold itself while you work. They hesitated. Someone frowned. Won't that collapse? Not if you respect it, she replied. Snow fails when you fight it, not when you listen. So they listened. They dug carefully, slowly, learning by feel how the packed layers resisted and yielded. They uncovered crushed walls and broken beams, but they did not try to resurrect what had already failed. Martha stopped them when they drifted back toward old plans, redirecting them toward what the land now allowed instead of what they wished it still was. They salvaged what they could: iron fittings, stove parts, intact boards, but the work shifted quickly from recovery to adaptation. The silo became the center of everything. They extended its usefulness without changing its nature. Windbreaks came first, low walls of packed snow reinforced with scavenged planks. set in curved arcs that mimicked the silo's shape rather than fighting it. Storage pits followed, dug into the drifted snow where the ground beneath stayed insulated. They carved sleeping alcoves into the packed banks along the silo's lee side, lining them with canvas and straw. The snow itself became a building material, dense and strong, warmer than air when handled correctly. Some of the men struggled with this more than others. Elias Porter was not one of them. He worked quietly now, asking questions when he didn't understand, listening when Martha answered. He learned quickly, not because he was naturally gifted, but because pride had finally loosened its grip on him. One evening, as they rested with their backs against the silo's wall, he spoke without looking at her. "I used to think strength meant standing up to the land," he said, "making it bend." Martha did not respond right away. "And now?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Now I think it means knowing when you're smaller than it." She nodded once. "That's a start." The others learned too, some faster than others. The children adapted fastest of all. They treated the new ways like a game at first, crawling through snow passages, helping pack walls, learning where warmth gathered and where cold bit hardest. Martha watched them carefully, correcting gently, letting them build instincts that might save them later. Weeks passed. The silo settlement grew outward in a way no one would have imagined before the storm. Not in straight lines, not with corners, everything curved or burrowed, shaped by wind and snow and necessity. Smoke rose from low vents instead of tall chimneys. Heat stayed close to the ground. Nothing stood alone anymore. And through it all, the silo remained unchanged at its core. Martha still slept inside it most nights, her small space intact, her routine steady. People came to her not as a novelty or a last resort now, but as a matter of course. Questions replaced jokes. Respect replaced laughter. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, but completely. No one apologized outright. Martha did not expect them to. Survival had a way of stripping language down to what mattered. Spring came late that year. When it did, it came carefully, like the land itself was wary of breaking anything else. The snow softened before it melted. Water ran slow and clear through channels they had planned for. Nothing flooded, nothing collapsed. The settlement endured the thaw the way it had endured the storm, by not pretending it was something it wasn't. When the first grass finally pushed through the snow, green and stubborn, someone laughed again. This time it was different. It wasn't disbelief, it was relief. By summer, travelers began to pass through again. They stopped at a place they did not recognize, drawn by the strange sight of a grain silo, surrounded by curved shelters, half buried in earth and snow. They asked questions. They listened to the answers. Some stayed longer than they meant to, and always, eventually, someone asked about the storm, about how this place had survived when others hadn't. The story spread slowly, changing as stories always do, but the truth at its center remained stubbornly intact. A widow, a silo, a refusal to build the same mistake twice. Martha did not correct embellishments. She did not encourage them either. She focused on the work in front of her, on the quiet rhythm of days shaped by understanding instead of defiance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the curved walls and packed earth, Elias stood beside her again, watching children chase each other along the snowbank that still lingered in shaded places. "They don't laugh anymore," he said. Martha followed his gaze. "No," she agreed. "They learned?" He hesitated. "Do you ever wish you'd built a cabin, like the rest of us?" She considered the question honestly. She looked at the silo, scarred, rusted, unchanged. She looked at what had grown around it, not despite it, but because of it. "No," she said. "I wish fewer people had needed a storm to understand why I didn't." The wind moved gently across the plains, not as an enemy now, but as a presence to be accounted for. The silo answered it with a low, familiar sound, steady and unafraid, and for the first time since she had walked away from her old life with nothing but tools and resolve, Martha felt something settle inside her that had nothing to do with shelter, belonging. The land had tested them, they had listened, and the grain silo, the thing they had mocked, dismissed, and nearly ignored, stood quietly at the center of it all, no longer strange, no longer temporary, simply proven. The first real test after the thaw came quietly. It arrived not as wind or snow, but as sound, hoofbeats, distant and uneven, carried across the open land in a way that made heads turn long before figures appeared. Travelers, 4 of them, approaching from the west with wagons light enough to have survived the winter elsewhere. They slowed when they saw the silo, slowed more when they saw what surrounded it. People gathered instinctively near the base of the metal structure, forming a loose half-circle that mirrored its curve. No one had told them to do that. It had simply become how they stood now. Martha did not move to the front. She stayed where she was, near the storage pits, hands dusted with soil, watching. The travelers dismounted cautiously. One of them laughed, not mockingly, but with a kind of wonder. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Looks like the land forgot to finish burying this place." Elias answered him before Martha could. "It tried," he said. "It didn't take That earned a few smiles, uncertain but genuine. The travelers asked for water, then food, then inevitably, shelter for the night. Their eyes kept drifting back to the silo, to the snow-shaped dwellings tucked against it, to the lack of straight lines and sharp corners. "Storm took your town?" one asked. Martha finally stepped forward. "Storm showed us what not to build again." They stayed the night. Around the fire pits, stories were exchanged, not just about the great storm, but about smaller failures too. Barns lost to wind, wells frozen solid, cabins that had looked sturdy until they weren't. The travelers listened more than they spoke. They asked questions that revealed their own doubts, their own quiet fear that the old ways were no longer enough. When they left the next morning, one of them lingered. He looked at the silo, then at Martha.